My name is Rachel Myrick, and I'm a professor of political science at Duke University. Today I'm going to be talking about how polarization poses challenges for democracies worldwide in their conduct of foreign affairs. Thank you all so much, and thank you so much for having me. So today, as the title suggests, I'm going to be talking about a book that's forthcoming in the fall called Polarization and International Politics. For the past few years, I've been very interested in this relationship between domestic polarization and international relations. And so the central question that this book asks is, how does polarization affect the behavior of democracies in international politics? We know from existing work in international relations that democracies tend to enjoy a lot of advantages in foreign affairs relative to non-democracies. But the main argument of this book is that polarization can weaken constraints on democratic leaders that are necessary to confer those advantages. As a result, it can make foreign policy more volatile, and it can make democracies less credible adversaries and less reliable allies. So what I want to do in this talk today is provide a bit of the background and the main argument for this book. And then because it's difficult to cover a whole book in one talk, I'm just going to zoom into one chapter that was circulated for today, Chapter 5, Polarization and the Credibility Advantage. And then while this book, I don't see this book as like specific to the Trump era. Naturally, there's lots of questions and connections to the current political moment. So I want to spend the end of the talk talking a little bit about the Trump first 100 days and whether some themes from the book resonate or where they do not resonate, hopefully as a jumping off point for a discussion. So the motivation for this book, of course, is recent concerns about polarization in advanced democracies. And these concerns are not unique to the United States. They've been affecting a wide variety of countries, mostly in Europe and the Americas, but also many countries in South Asia, some countries in East Asia. But also polarization is not a new phenomenon, right? It's been a long-standing feature of democratic politics, both in the US and elsewhere, for a long time. Two quick examples. On the left is a map of the 1880 US presidential election, reflecting a deep racial divide emerging between the parties emerging out of the Reconstruction era. On the right is a photograph of French socialist politician Léon Blum. In the 1930s, the French right wing adopted the slogan, "Better Hitler than Blum," suggesting that foreign occupation might be preferable to socialist control of France. So in democracies in general, political contestation, partisan disagreement, these are healthy features of liberal democracy. But these environments are environments of what I might term extreme polarization. And in the book, I talk about environments of extreme polarization as being distinctive in four senses. The first is that in these contexts, ideological polarization, that is increasing policy distance between the parties, and affective polarization, that is increasing social distance between parties, tend to co-occur and reinforce one another. Second, in these environments, the stakes of winning electoral office are heightened, such that politicians increasingly have incentives to tilt the playing field, which is associated with processes of democratic erosion or democratic backsliding. Third, ideologues or party activists in these environments often have incentives to extend partisan conflict to new policy domains, such that policy issues that weren't necessarily central to a partisan cleavage can easily become politicized. And finally, and perhaps most relevant for this project, environments of extreme polarization are also characterized by a weakening of constraints on democratic leaders, which has all sorts of interesting downstream implications for foreign policy making. So this book is rooted in the academic literature on the domestic politics of international relations. And a lot of that research focuses on the causes and consequences of regime type. It asks questions like, how do democracies behave differently from autocracies in international politics? A lot of newer work in this area focuses on variation among authoritarian regimes. It talks about how different types of autocracies are more or less cooperative or conflictual in international politics. But of course, there's a lot of variation among democracies, and this book is arguing that an underappreciated source of that variation in foreign policymaking actually comes from partisan polarization, and in particular, the presence of extreme polarization. So the theoretical framework in this book is rooted in and is a response to what would be termed the democratic advantage tradition in international relations theory. This is the idea that democracies, on average, enjoy a lot of advantages in foreign affairs relative to non-democracies. This book focuses on 3 advantages in particular. The first is a stability advantage, or the ability to keep foreign policy relatively consistent despite regular leader turnover. The second is a credibility advantage, or the ability to leverage domestic constraints to be able to credibly signal information abroad to foreign adversaries. And the third is a reliability advantage, or the ability to be able to make and keep commitments to your allies. This book talks about how these 2 advantages are really upheld by 2 systems of constraint within democracies. First, vertical constraints keep the leaders accountable to the public or to an electorate. And second, horizontal constraints keep leaders accountable to other actors within government. And in particular, this book focuses on the role of the political opposition or opposition parties or the opposition coalition. And then the theory chapter in this book, which I didn't circulate for this talk, but I'll just briefly describe to you, it looks at how polarization actually interacts with these different constraints, and then in turn what implications that has for each of these 3 advantages. The overarching argument is that extreme polarization weakens vertical and horizontal constraints on democratic leaders, in turn undermining these democratic advantages. And I want to pause here quickly and mention that this is not the cover of the book. This is actually something my dad texted me just for fun. He's recently retired and doesn't quite know how academic publishing works, but he wanted to participate in the process. And so this is mainly for the undergrads to let you know that your parents will continue to do endearing and embarrassing things even when you are arguably a professional. This is the actual cover of the book designed by the professionals. It's coming out with Princeton University Press in the fall. The empirical approach of the book is kind of threefold. The first empirical chapter is really a chapter about a lot of descriptive data. It uses new measures of extreme polarization and incorporates them into existing analyses of democratic advantages, basically looking at correlations between polarization and different foreign policy outcomes. And then, the rest of the book really takes a deep dive into one specific context, the case of contemporary US foreign policy, to better be able to illustrate the pathways through which polarization might affect the stability, credibility, and reliability of the US in the future. Each of these chapters follows a pretty similar structure. First, they look at the relationship between polarization and vertical constraints using a combination of public opinion polling and survey experiments. Then it looks at the relationship between polarization and horizontal constraints, talking about kind of some historical things and also some descriptive data on the behavior of politicians. And then lastly, it talks about the implications for the democratic advantage, drawing primarily on some interviews and also a variety of different cases. The last chapter discusses how polarization in foreign policy might be mitigated. It talks a little bit about when polarization actually might be a good thing, and then talks about extending this framework to other cases outside the US. Today, as I mentioned, because that's a lot to cover, I'm just going to deep dive into one chapter, and this is primarily to give you a sense of the types of arguments and evidence this book draws on. This chapter focuses on the credibility advantage. And credibility is a term with a lot of uses in international relations. Here I'm specifically talking about the fact that democracies are able to leverage domestic constraints to better signal information when they bargain with a foreign adversary. There are lots of different implications of this advantage, but the book focuses on 2 in particular. For one, democracies are able to leverage agreement between the domestic actors to signal resolve in an international crisis. What I mean by that is that if the public or the political opposition rallies behind the executive, that's actually a very strong show of support or a show of force. It kind of increases the credibility of a threat. That's an argument that's associated with political scientist Ken Schultz's work, Democracy and Coercive Diplomacy. Another implication of the credibility advantage is that democracies are able to leverage disagreement, moderate forms of disagreement, between domestic actors to extract concessions in a negotiation. An executive is able to point to the domestic political opposition and say, my opposition won't accept this deal, be able to credibly say that, therefore extract more from the adversary that they're bargaining with. This is an argument that's commonly associated with Tom Schelling's work as well as Robert Putnam's work on two-level games. The theory chapter then walks through how polarization interacts with each of these constraints and in particular contrasts what happens in an ideal type healthy liberal democracy and contrasts that with what happens in extremely polarized democracy. So starting with vertical constraints and accountability to the public, in an ideal type liberal democracy, we might think about the public as likely to trust the foreign policy decision-making of an executive and likely to kind of punish them for making bad judgments in foreign policy. But as polarization becomes more extreme, the public is going to be less likely to trust the decision-making of an out-party president, and they're going to be more likely to reward co-partisan politicians for obstructing that president. Thinking about the role of polarization and horizontal constraints, in an ideal type liberal democracy, the political opposition is likely to rally behind the executive during times of crisis and then demonstrate, kind of principled disagreement when there are differences in policy. But as polarization increases, politicians are going to be increasingly likely to just obstruct to the out-party leader, and they are going to be less likely to rally behind the executive during times of crisis. This has all sorts of interesting implications for these credibility advantages, and it makes it harder for democracies to send credible signals during crises and in the context of negotiations. The chapter that I circulated uses 3 different strategies to kind of get at the different components of this argument. First, a survey experiment, then some descriptive data, and then a case illustration of US-Iranian relations in the context of negotiating the Iran nuclear deal. So I'll briefly walk through each of these components. First, looking at this relationship between vertical and horizontal constraints, I look at a survey experiment and specifically try to focus on how partisanship shapes evaluations of the foreign policy decision-making of a president. This survey experiment was fielded in August 2024 to a sample of over 4,000 US adults. And again, the goal of this experiment is to look at how partisanship conditions the evaluations of foreign policy judgments. In the experiment, I collected demographic information of survey respondents, including information about their partisanship. And then the respondents were randomly assigned to one of 2 conditions. They were told to imagine a scenario in which either the Democratic candidate, Kamala Harris, won election, or the Republican candidate, Donald Trump, won the election. And then they were asked to kind of envision what they expected that president to do in foreign policy. Then with that same president, they were posed 2 sets of hypothetical scenarios. The first set of scenarios was a crisis scenario. They read either about a hypothetical Russian invasion of Estonia or about a hypothetical Chinese invasion of Taiwan. And then the second scenario was a negotiation scenario. So they read either about the US negotiating a new agreement with Iran or the US restarting nuclear talks with North Korea. After each of the scenarios, they were asked a series of outcome questions. In particular, I looked at how they evaluated presidential judgment and decision-making, how they evaluated the policy response of the president, and then what they thought about Congress obstructing the president's response. So I'll walk through the main findings from the survey with you now. The first outcome that I look at is foreign policy judgment. So here in all these plots that I'm showing you, I'm just going to show you the proportion of respondents in each condition. Democratic respondents are in blue and Republicans are in red. On the left are survey respondents in the out-party condition. That is, they read about the president from the opposite party. And on the right are survey respondents from the in-party condition. That is, they read about a president of their own party. So the first question is whether the president would show good judgment in responding to this crisis. And here, perhaps unsurprisingly, what we see is that respondents are much more likely to think that an in-party president would show good judgment in responding to this crisis relative to an out-party president. Perhaps not surprising to see some partisan bias here, but it's quite a large partisan gap. For the negotiation scenario, I asked whether they thought the president would negotiate an agreement that is good with the US, with either Iran or North Korea. And here again, we see partisan bias in evaluations, that people are much more likely to think that an in-party president would negotiate an agreement that's good for the US. A sort of trickier test of partisan bias is actually to hold fixed the policy response, the same policy response across both candidates, and then see if people update their beliefs differently. So here, I told people in the crisis scenario that the president, either Trump or Harris, would send in US military troops to either defend Estonia or Taiwan. And what we see here is that a partisan bias still exists across all the conditions, but it's not quite as strong as in the evaluations of presidential judgment. In the negotiation scenario, respondents were told that the president either is going to negotiate a new agreement with Iran or restart talks with North Korea. And again, here we see a stronger partisan bias in attitudes towards policy responses in the negotiation scenario. Lastly, I look at how respondents think about, or the extent to which they endorse obstruction, how they think that the congressional Democrats or Republicans should respond to the president. I give them a variety of answer options, and I code obstruction as respondents who think that congressional Republicans in the Harris case or congressional Democrats in the Trump case should both express disapproval and also take some additional actions to try and stop the president from enacting their policy. What we see here is that respondents are more likely to approve of obstructing an out-party president, but the majority still don't advocate for flat-out obstruction. Again, these results look pretty similar in the negotiation scenarios. Another thing that I emphasize throughout the survey is that the effects tend to be stronger among the subset of respondents who are strong partisans, who display high levels of affective polarization, that is, who display favoritism towards their in-party and dislike of their out-party. So overall, what this first component found is that as polarization grows, we should expect more people to strongly identify with a party and for partisan identity to strengthen. And we know that partisans are going to be more likely to distrust the out-party leader and to approve of their obstruction, and this effect is going to be stronger among strong partisans. So now the next part of the chapter moves on to look specifically at how polarization interacts with horizontal constraints and the role of the political opposition. And to do so, it draws on a lot of different sources of descriptive data and to look at kind of cross-time trends in what's happened as domestic polarization has increased in the United States. How has the behavior of the political opposition changed in foreign affairs? I'll just provide you a few quick examples here rather than running through all the technical details, but I'm happy to talk a little bit more about this in Q&A. The top kind of the main overarching takeaway of this section is that if you use congressional roll call votes on foreign affairs and defense policy to kind of construct a two-dimensional space that maps out the foreign policy preferences of legislators, what you basically find is that over time, congressional roll call votes show increasing coherence of the political opposition against the president in foreign affairs. So in the example that I'm showing you here, this is a map of congressional legislators during the Carter administration, with the Republicans all represented in red. That's the political opposition, and Jimmy Carter represented there in blue. As you see, there's a relatively large distance in ideological space between the president and the median Republican legislator. Fast forward to the Obama administration, Obama's position pretty similar distance between Obama and the median legislator, but what looks different is that the Republicans have sort of cohered against the president in voting in foreign affairs and defense policy. Of course, in the book, what I'm interested in is not just kind of behavior in foreign affairs writ large, but more specifically how the political opposition is responding and reacting to international crises. And so another exercise I undertake in the book is to use the digitized congressional record to measure partisanship of speech about crises that are triggered by foreign adversaries. I'll spare you the technical details, but the overarching takeaway from that exercise is that over time, as domestic polarization has increased, congressional responses to crises that are initiated by foreign adversaries have actually become more partisan. And this maps onto what we know about general patterns of domestic polarization. So the takeaway from this section is that as polarization is growing in US politics, we're seeing more coherence of roll call voting in foreign affairs and defense policy, and we're also seeing more partisan responses to individual security crises in Congress. So, what does all this mean? What are some of the potential implications? The last exercise I do is look at an individual case. One of the things I mentioned earlier is that leaders can leverage moderate forms of disagreement between domestic actors to extract concessions in international negotiations. So this is an effective strategy at moderate levels of polarization, but as polarization grows more extreme, this advantage is sort of diminished. For one, there are incentives for the opposition to increasingly obstruct or derail negotiations. In addition, leaders might be just deterred from initiating complex negotiations with foreign adversaries in the first place. Moreover, anticipating opposition from Congress, for example, leaders might box out the opposition from the negotiations, losing leverage that would otherwise come from more moderate forms of disagreement. So to examine this phenomenon, I use specifically the case of the 2015 negotiation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, more commonly known as the Iran nuclear deal. And I conducted a variety of interviews in DC about how politicization around the deal impacted US negotiators and impacted the interactions between the Obama White House and the Hill. What's particularly interesting in this case is that there was a lot of politicization that was going on separately during the time in the lead up to the 2016 Republican presidential primary. So, for example, an interview with a senior White House official, the interviewee said, originally we thought for sure we would get Republican support from this deal, support from Senator Bob Corker and co., but this happened to be an electoral cycle where many aspiring Republican presidential candidates were on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, so it made sense to be hawkish on Iran. During the Republican primary, the first person would say, I'm going to rip up the Iran deal, and the second person would say, I'm going to rip it up on the first day in office, and the third would say, I'm going to burn it first and then rip it up. And so you can see this sort of changing dynamics around the politicization of the deal. A variety of actions taken by Republican legislators during this time also contributed to this environment of mutual mistrust between the White House and the Hill. You may recall, for example, Republican Speaker of the House John Boehner inviting Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to give a speech to Congress. And this very famous open letter to Iranian leadership by Senator Tom Cotton, signed by a number of other congressional Republicans, essentially saying to Iranian leadership, any deal that you sign with the Obama administration will be invalid. So as a consequence of this, the Obama White House increasingly came to view Congress and congressional Republicans in particular as kind of pure spoilers, that it didn't matter what the deal was, they just wouldn't accept any element of it. And so they increasingly sought to sort of box out Congress from the process. So this is an interview with a Democratic staff member on SFRC who was also critical of how the White House handled the interactions with the Hill on this issue just because there was so much mutual mistrust. She said, we were trying to understand the parameters of what the Obama administration was negotiating. To be honest, I found it quite difficult. Despite having personal contacts at state, there was a lockdown in terms of the detail of what they were doing, and that was because there was so much mistrust. What this indicates, or one of the kind of interesting implications here, is that politicization around US-Iranian relations in the context of what was going on in domestic politics at the time, meant that the White House wasn't able to leverage moderate Republicans when negotiating the deal. And of course, the deal was ultimately passed with no Republican support and potentially was a less durable agreement as a consequence of that. The overarching takeaway from this chapter is that as polarization becomes more extreme, it weakens vertical and horizontal constraints on leaders, and it becomes harder for leaders to effectively leverage those constraints to signal information to foreign adversaries. Stepping back, I think this book makes kind of three overarching contributions. The first is to offer a corrective to the democratic advantage tradition in international relations. So there have been a lot of critiques of this tradition, but this is sort of a new critique that comes specifically from thinking about how permanent features of domestic politics can actually erode some of the advantages that democracies have when making foreign policy. In doing so, another contribution of the book is to link research on the effects of polarization on democratic institutions and political behavior, in particular American political behavior, to theories of international relations. And finally, it does a lot in the book to characterize the trajectory of polarization in US foreign policy in particular, and to talk a bit about which issues are more susceptible to polarization. In these last couple minutes, I want to make a few connections to the current political moment, with the caveat, of course, that this isn't a book about the Trump administration per se, but I think there are a lot of interesting connections to what's going on right now. One theme that comes up elsewhere in the book is about how polarization erodes the stability advantage. And I think one of the overarching takeaways from that chapter is that in the United States, foreign policy is less polarized on average than domestic policy, but there's a lot of increasing polarization on certain foreign policy issues, and those are the sets of issues that are going to be the most volatile and least stable with presidential turnover. And so the book discusses three sets of issues in particular that might be susceptible to this dynamic. The first are issues that link to social identity. So in American politics, we've seen the extension of partisan conflict from economic issues to social issues, and now we're seeing the trickling in of some of these social issues linking to foreign policy. We've seen recent examples of this in the first 100 days with the Trump administration undoing a lot of Biden-era refugee and immigration policy, changes to refugee resettlement programs, ending of TPS, and so forth. The second set of issues, I think, that are very susceptible to polarization in the US are issues that relate to non-traditional security threats. So these are things like global health security and climate security. And of course, we've already seen with the changeover of the administration, reversal of US climate policy as the Trump administration has announced that the US will withdraw once again from the Paris Agreement. And the third set of issues that I think are prone to politicization are issues that involve ideological debates about multilateralism or internationalism. There's been sort of an undercurrent in the Republican Party of skepticism of some of these principles and a rethinking of some of these principles. And we've seen, of course, recent examples of the Trump administration walking back kind of internationalist commitments and dismantling international development assistance. Another theme elsewhere in the book is about how the stability of foreign policy is undermined not just by diverging preferences across the parties, but also by the increasing incentive as polarization increases to politicize national security institutions that otherwise are helpful in effectively checking executive power. And so the book, I didn't circulate this particular chapter, but the book actually walks through like a typology of different strategies of politicization. And we're seeing the Trump administration engage in a lot of this transformation of the national security bureaucracy, or at least start to engage in some of that. And that is something where if we expect that to continue, that would be something that would induce some instability across presidential administrations. In chapter 6, I talk about polarization and the reliability advantage. That how, as Congress becomes more polarized, there are incentives for the president to try and circumvent Congress from making foreign policy, to use alternative tools, for example, substituting non-binding political commitments for international treaties, and to make and break foreign commitments more unilaterally, which of course then makes them easier to undo in the future. in the future, we can actually imagine a world in which the parties have fundamentally different relationships with allies and adversaries. I don't think we're in that world yet, but we're seeing kind of some glimpses of that, and I think it's interesting to consider what might happen to U.S. foreign policy if that were to be the case. Overall, I think the takeaway from this book is that polarization is an important but an underappreciated source of variation in democratic foreign policy making. It could have major implications for the stability, credibility, and reliability of democracies. And as more democracies grapple with polarization, it's going to be really important to understand its relationship with international politics. So thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much for your talk. I was wondering, how you think the court system factors into your understanding of the horizontal constraints, especially with sort of the Trump era stuff about courts blocking certain things or circumventing the court.
Yes, absolutely. So it's something that I don't go into great depth in the book project. So the book project talks about how there are lots of other horizontal constraints that aren't the focus of the project. This project focuses specifically on the role of the political opposition, just because they're the kind of primary actors that we would think of as integral in this foreign policy decision-making process. But you're absolutely right that the courts are another, important check on political power. So are, as I mentioned, national security institutions. We might also think about the role of the media or civil society as additional horizontal constraints. And I think we're going to see kind of more discussion of what the courts may do in response to some of these actions with some interesting implications for foreign policy. But unfortunately, the book right now doesn't directly speak to that. And I think it's going to be a important area for future research.
Thanks for your time. My name is Marco. I'm an undergrad. I'm interested in the findings of your credibility advantage. So it seems to me like credibility is something that some states see from others, that it's not a tangible thing that someone can say a state's really credible. So it seems to me at least in the Iran-U.S. case, credibility would depend on what the Iranians saw from the U.S. And it doesn't seem to me like that's what the case talks about very much. I kind of understand why that is in the Iran case. I mean, it's probably difficult to get information. But even someone as committed to two-level games as Putnam said, that uncertainty is really, really common, that it's really difficult to understand the domestic politics of other states. So I guess I'm interested in how or why you think it would be possible for states to well understand the domestic politics of their adversaries, and particularly in the Iran-U.S. case, how that functions and how that actually, I guess, proves the argument.
Yeah, this is a great question. So ideally, right, you would be able to actually talk to Iranian leadership and to think about how Iranian leadership viewed what was going on in the United States. Because obviously I didn't have that sort of access, I had to rely on discussions with U.S. negotiators about how the discussions that they had with Iranian leadership and how they felt about what was being said. But you're right, it's I would say one step removed from the ideal evidence that you would have. In some other projects, I've been trying to get at this question of perception a little bit more directly, because I think one of the intuitions that I think your question points out is that concepts like credibility and reliability, they're really perceptual outcomes, right? And so one thing that I've done in part in the book and also in some other papers is to try to do some more public opinion research, both with elites and with the general public in other countries, that focuses on their perceptions of polarization in the United States and how heightening perceptions of polarization in the United States makes them think about other outcomes. And so that's again, another indirect piece of evidence, but I think it's moving towards the types of outcomes we might be interested in, because this is really a tough nut to crack, since fundamentally credibility is a perceptual outcome.
Thank you, and congratulations. New book coming out on Princeton on a very timely topic. So
too timely.
Well, I do national security studies. Sure. My attitude is war is good for business and peace is a disaster. So that's how I sort of think about these things. So I want to ask two questions. you framed this as a corrective to the Democratic advantage literature. I'm somebody who's
Sure.
also corrected the Democratic advantage literature. Indeed, there are a lot of us. The Ryder and Stamm have attracted a lot of attention. The democracy and credibility literature has been, corrected. Some might say destroyed by people like Downs and Sexer and things like that. Whether we've done that or not, is it fair to say that you're assuming that the Democratic advantage literature operates as claimed, but that in the context of political polarization, it doesn't operate quite that way? Now, the reason I put it that way is there seems to be, and I can only say based on reading the 2 chapters and also reading them with my brain still 12 time zones west of here, that you're assuming politics as usual works pretty well. And the problem is the divergence from politics as usual. Polarization, takes us away from foreign policy stopping at the water's edge. But that gives a lot of weight to the Democratic advantage literature that, other correctives, I think, take a very different approach to. But is that fair to say, roughly, the gestalt of your argument?
I think that's a fair characterization of the argument.
Okay.
But I'll respond to it in a minute, but I'm interested in the rest of your...
Yeah. So the second question then is, what if it were the case that political polarization had substantial roots precisely in what the Democratic advantage literature wants to advance? Think about, for example, arguments about the decreasing commitment to free trade or other forms of international engagement, precisely because those forms of international engagement can foster polarization. So, for example, free trade, pretty clearly has unequal effects within the United States. And I guess I'm sort of a Marxist, but if people are getting poor as a result of free trade, they aren't going to like it. And they may be attracted to more extreme political positions. So I guess the 2 things are that by hitching your wagon as closely as you do to the Democratic advantage literature, you actually, even though you're critiquing it or correcting it, you're still heavily dependent on that in a way. It's got to be right, and if it's not right, then in a sense, the implications of these findings, at least for the the real world, are probably less meaningful. And then secondly, if the phenomenon, polarization, which certainly you've documented, you and other people have documented, is clearly a fact, but if there's an effect from business as usual in terms of foreign policy that's also contributing to political polarization, don't we need to think about it outside of the Democratic advantage literature?
Really thought-provoking questions. I'm going to just sort of take them in reverse. So the second question that you point out, so this is actually the motivation for the outset at the outset why there was a graphic that showed domestic polarization and international relations in this sort of cyclical relationship. So to me, this first book project is about how domestic polarization is affecting international politics. But I'm starting a second book project, as I was mentioning to Joe earlier, about how the international system shapes and structures patterns of domestic polarization. So I think that will get a bit closer to this question about the relationship between globalization, technological change, shifts, populism, changing patterns of polarization, because you're right that I think to a certain extent some of that's bracketed off in talking about the roots of this global trend in this particular, in this theory, I think. To your first point on thinking about this as a corrective to the democratic advantage, I mean, the way I think about the democratic advantage tradition is that there's kind of like two buckets of critiques, one being the realist critique that, when push comes to shove, democracies are going to act on their own national interests. And then the second being the writers that are pointing out that a lot of autocracies are also constrained in various ways, and so therefore we shouldn't necessarily think that some autocratic foreign policy making is going to be very differentiated from democratic foreign policy making. I see this as taking a slightly different corrective, which is, they're actually kind of permanent features of democratic politics that are themselves potentially undermining some of these advantages. And so I guess I would position it a little bit in the middle of some of those pots, and I think you could still believe pieces of this argument without fully subscribing to the democratic advantage tradition. It's just sort of talking about how we should think about the democratic advantage ideal type as a starting point and what happens when we start to kind of complicate that relationship.
Could I just quickly follow up? Mm-hmm. It seems to me there's a third or maybe a fourth argument that it's precisely the normal operation of democracy that may produce some of these problems. Yeah. So, there's a classic literature,
right,
going, at least back to Thucydides that makes this argument, but also, modern political science literature, Downs,
yep.
For example, that suggests that democracy, it does not produce the sort of clear and consistent preferences that I think these models,
right,
assume that it does.
I don't think that argument, though, is incompatible with thinking through how polarization might further erode these constraints and what the implications might be for foreign policy making. So the way the theory is set up is comparing kind of an ideal type liberal democracy. Here's how this should function. In reality, you're certainly right? There's lots of potential problems with democracy. And so it's more of I would say like a thought exercise of how should this work in theory, what happens when we introduce more extreme forms of polarization, and of course we see varying degrees of polarization in the world that we can kind of use as heuristics for thinking about that. So in short, I would say I don't think you need to be kind of fully subscribed to the democratic advantage tradition to be able to find something that you might think is kind of interesting or an interesting contribution to thinking about democratic foreign policy in this book.
Thank you.
Professor Lowey?
Yeah, thank you very much for a fun talk. First thing that struck me is looking at today's political landscape. Is it Trump or is it polarization? So what's
the chicken or the egg?
Exactly. So I'm just thinking what's causing what in this story, and then also what about polarization has these effects? Is it because polarization weakens the country, and then these three effects are symptoms of that weakening? So what's the story there, or is something else going on? It could be by definition polarization means that there are extreme positions on both parties, and therefore you're going to get something different than the mainstream.
Right. So on that latter point, it's a bit of both, right? There's an argument about diverging policy preferences here, but there's also an argument about the erosion of institutions that help maintain stability over time. And so I would say that we can think about this, both the weakening of vertical constraints and also the weakening of horizontal constraints, both as a function of changing preferences and also as a function of eroding some of these institutions. And so it's kind of like a compound argument in that sense. In terms of whether it's polarization or whether it's Trump, I find this always a tricky question because it's like hard to disaggregate the two in the kind of contemporary discourse. But I feel like polarization is a phenomenon that precedes Trump. I actually started this book project pre-Trump, and then it became more salient in the Trump era. And so folks always say, oh, you were in grad school during the Trump era, so this must be the impetus for the project, but actually was looking at some of the dynamics in the Obama administration where there was lots of interesting partisan debates around foreign policy. And so in short, I think that the phenomena that I'm talking about will certainly outlast Trump and be kind of relevant far beyond the current administration.
I have two fingers on that. You telegraphed in your talk that sometimes polarization can be a performance-enhancing drug in democracy, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the circumstances under which that is true, and then maybe give us some hope and talk about the conditions under which depolarization might be.
Yes. So how it can be a performance-enhancing drug, meaning how it can be a positive thing.
Yeah, you just polarization
Yeah.
is an advantage.
Sure. So I think always kind of these moderate levels of political polarization are an advantage. That is functionally what gives rise to this credibility advantage, for example, right? Moderate levels of disagreement, you're able to extract concessions. If everyone agrees on everything and there's no political contestation, then there's no kind of advantage. And so again, partisan disagreement kind of in a healthy way is a good thing. I also think people, generally often partisanship or the kind of circumstances that we're seeing in the US right now and kind of increasing partisanship in foreign affairs, some people think that's a good thing in terms of being able to actually expand the debate about what US foreign policy should look like, what the US role in the world should be. And so to the extent that partisan disagreement is reflecting sincere, principled, interesting debates, I would say that's a positive thing, right? Because a lot of people are quite critical of just the maintenance of status quo US foreign policy. And so that's a good thing, but my concern often is that the types of partisan politics that we're seeing aren't actually helping that debate flourish. They're actually kind of stifling and crowding out that debate. So that is kind of one of my concerns. In terms of processes of depolarization, there's some interesting research by Jennifer McCoy and some of her co-authors who have looked at this cross-nationally. I think their overarching takeaway, they look at what's called pernicious polarization, which is akin to sort of extreme polarization, although they're specifically focused more on the affective polarization side of things. And I think their conclusions are, first of all, the sort of rare event where a society rapidly depolarizes, there's something else going on, right? There's a regime change or some sort of major external shock or a civil conflict or so forth, and that's something we certainly aren't wishing for in the US. But more generally, these processes actually tend to be pretty incremental and cyclical, so you see these kind of ebbing and flowing of polarization and depolarization that are quite gradual, almost bottom-up processes. I think very similar to processes of democratic erosion. So the case that she traces is Hungary, actually talking about how it was very polarized pre-1989 and then becomes less polarized and now is more polarized again since post-2010. And so you sort of see this ebbing and flowing. That's not very satisfactory to the US case, so we could talk specifically about strategies to reduce polarization in the US if you all wanted to go there. Well, there's a lot of them, so I won't summarize the whole literature, but I generally think there's kind of, or I think about like 3 buckets of strategies for like how do we face this problem in the US? What do we do with polarization and foreign policy? So the first bucket of strategies I would think of is strategies that seek to kind of insulate foreign affairs from partisan politics. And so, how do you kind of more effectively make it so you have essentially a partisan truce in national security policy, for example? And so there are some kind of movements to do this. A lot of them involve, building coalitions of legislators, or trying to kind of reach agreements, maybe building out national security institutions, some reform in foreign policy institutions to try and strengthen, for example, the Foreign Service and other entities that might help contribute to the nonpartisan character of foreign policy. Then the second and third bucket of strategies, I think, are just more strategies for how do we think about strengthening horizontal and vertical constraints in the context of increasing polarization. So those are strategies to reduce congressional polarization and strategies to reduce affective polarization among the public. Lots of different, potential strategies in there that have been well covered by the American politics literature. But I think from my perspective, some of the overarching takeaways from that literature is there's not really kind of an easy solution, and a lot of solutions that are talked about very commonly in the media, like let's just overhaul the electoral system. There's a lot of skepticism among political scientists that those solutions will actually be effective. And so unfortunately, there's not kind of an easy one-size-fits-all, but if eventually you read the book, there's a lot of discussion in the conclusion chapter about all the different strategies that political scientists have talked about. And of course, political scientists like to say all of these strategies are wrong. So
I actually do have a question about the different types of polarization.
Yeah.
Is polarization, or if different groups were to have different types of polarization, would we see different weaknesses in the credibility advantage? So I'm thinking specifically of, in the first chapter, you say that the evidence for ideological polarization among elites is strong and affective polarization among the public strong. But that doesn't really, those specific types of polarization don't really seem to map out onto vertical and horizontal constraints in the later chapter. So again, if, say, elites were to be affectively polarized instead of ideologically polarized, would there be a difference in horizontal constraints? And if the public were to be ideologically polarized instead of affectively polarized, would there be a difference in the type of vertical constraints? Or is polarization, and any type is pretty much the same?
This is another really interesting question. I think, to me, this would seem like a potential extension of this theory, right? You're right that the theory doesn't really speak to this, because what I'm conceptualizing of extreme polarization is actually environments in which these two forms of polarization reinforce one another. And actually, what's interesting is the inability to disentangle whether there's sincere policy disagreement or whether this person's just objecting because they don't like the other party is precisely what leads to that difficulty, those muddled signals, for example, sent to other international actors. And so the short answer here is the theory doesn't dive into that, because in practice, those two things are very hard to tease out. Because in practice they're very correlated, right? And so even if we think about our own partisan identity, do you dislike this politician because of their policies or because you dislike their partisanship? It's actually hard to separate those two things, kind of from a measurement standpoint. But it would be interesting to potentially, one way I think you could maybe get into this is if you looked at contexts where there was high levels of affective polarization, but maybe lower levels of ideological polarization and vice versa, and you might be able to then maybe get some traction on this question about whether the erosion of constraints operated differently in those environments. So that's actually an interesting potential extension.
You mentioned toward the end of your discussion that polarization becomes even more dangerous where political parties have different relationships with foreign leaders or entities. And I'm almost wondering if you're starting to see that with relations to Putin and Zelensky in the recent debates and the fallout in the Oval Office and all of the ensuing stories we're hearing from this. And then as a follow-up, how can domestic parties or institutions work against international actors that might seek to further polarize political opponents and take advantage of that weakness?
So you've put your finger on precisely why you could think about that dynamic as being very troubling, right? Because, if parties had fundamentally different relationships with different allies and adversaries, right, then there's incentives for the foreign actors maybe to become more involved and have more at stake in these different electoral outcomes. And so that's kind of a scary world. I don't think we're totally in that world right now, as I alluded to, but you can certainly see how that can happen. It's happened in other places, and I think the example you mentioned kind of speaks to that sort of trend. One of the reasons why I think that that's particularly troubling, right? We always, we naturally would expect parties to disagree on policy responses, right? People might have different ideas about Russia policy or China policy, but it's concerning to me if we don't share kind of some common threat perceptions, right? If one party thinks that this is an adversary and one party thinks that this is a friend, right? Then it's very difficult to start to talk about common strategies, and it's very difficult to maintain consistency, which is particularly concerning in foreign affairs, given that foreign affairs requires these long time horizons to maintain these relationships across different administrations. So it's a disconcerting thought, for sure.
I had a question concerning how this carries outside the United States, particularly within kind of the bucket of democracies on the variation of executive discretion over foreign policy. Because obviously your argument works feasibly better in countries where there are high legislative constraints on foreign policy. Therefore, the credibility gap goes down, whereas in other countries where executive has a lot of discretion, then if I'm a kind of another country looking at the situation, I'm like, the executive thinks this anyway, and the executive controls it. So if there's high polarization, this restraint that's going to come from an out party in the legislature might not actually matter that much. So I'm curious if you see that variation based on these types of institutional differences, even within the Democratic bucket.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly think the predictions are not as sort of straightforward as you've laid out necessarily, right? So if we think just very simply about, I think the easiest analogy for variation and horizontal constraints is to think about differences in parliamentary versus presidential systems. But that doesn't necessarily reflect differences, as you point out, in like executive autonomy and foreign policy decision making, right? And so you could think about a variety of different structures that might operate in different ways. And it's not actually clear to in this context, obviously in the U.S., where we have a very kind of strong legislator traditionally, that's going to look a little bit different in a parliamentary system. But I don't actually think that the predictions are very straightforward. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the configuration of institutions doesn't map neatly onto the actual like de facto discretion the executive has when they make foreign policy. So again, a really, I think, promising future direction for the project. When I started the project, I was thinking I'd be ambitious and do sort of go down this road, and then you realize the projects are too big, and so you have to cut off one chunk of it. And so I focused a lot on the U.S. institutional context, but I'm quite interested in thinking about polarization and foreign policy comparatively in some future work. All right, last question. Last question to Grace.
Well, so I might be stumbling a little bit because this question is not really fully formed, but I'm just thinking about polarization in the context of other countries, and I'm wondering, I know your research focuses a lot on kind of how polarization impacts democratic government structures, but with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we're seeing kind of how polarization comes into play with extra-governmental organizations as well, like Hamas. And I'm wondering if you could, I wonder how that would kind of work into your research, or if that's something you've considered studying, how organizations that aren't necessarily official governments but still claim to speak for a public play into.
I mean, I think there's kind of a similar flavor in there about like how would I extend the argument to non-democracies, and so I think some of the I've thought about this a bit, but it is challenging because there's not, kind of the fixed institutional context. There's also not, political parties that have these articulated policy preferences. So it's hard to kind of map or think about mapping divergence of preferences over time across the parties. But we might think more generally about how types of polarization or other forms of societal polarization beyond partisan polarization could still, in theory, weaken different forms of constraints in authoritarian regimes, or maybe when we think about non-state actors. But again, I don't know if it's a super straightforward extension of the theory, just because the focus on political parties is really intended to focus on organized groups that have articulated policy platforms, so it's easier to measure than ideological distance between the parties.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
All right, let's thank Professor Myrick for debuting her book.
Thanks. Thank you.